It was supposed to be a safe place, a city shelter where stray dogs, abandoned cats, and injured animals would come for a second chance at life. But for one small dog, Charlie, it felt more like a prison. For weeks, his cries for help echoed throughout the shelter, ignored by those who were supposed to care. It wasn't until a simple decision to take him to the vet revealed something that no one could have ever imagined. What happened next would leave everyone in shock, changing not only Charlie's life, but also the lives of everyone who had come into contact with him. Stay with us as we uncover a hidden story of abuse, survival, and healing. One that proves just how far love and compassion can go in the face of unimaginable cruelty. The shelter was a place of contradictions. On one hand, it was supposed to be a sanctuary, a place of safety, food, and shelter for animals who had nowhere else to go. On the other hand, it was often overcrowded, underfunded, and overwhelmed by the constant stream of animals coming through its doors. For every dog who was adopted, two more took its place. And for every animal who found a forever home, there were those who were left behind. Forgotten in the chaotic corridors of the shelter, their cries faded into the background of daily life. Charlie was one of those dogs. He had been brought in by a concerned stranger who found him wandering the streets, hungry, weak, and clearly neglected. Charlie's fur was patchy, his ribs visible through his thin coat, and his eyes were wide with fear. From the moment he arrived at the shelter, it was clear that he had endured a lot. But despite his fragile appearance, no one really noticed him. Lisa, the senior shelter worker, was too busy to take a personal interest in each animal. With years of experience, she had learned to manage the chaos of the shelter without getting too emotionally involved. She had seen too many sad eyes and broken bodies to let them affect her. "Another stray," Lisa muttered, as she checked Charlie into the system. "He'll be fine." Charlie was placed in a small kennel in the back of the shelter, far from the more lively areas where dogs barked excitedly and visitors passed by, eager to meet a new friend. Charlie's kennel was quieter, less visible, and that's how the shelter staff preferred it. The small, timid dogs tended to be forgotten, especially ones who were clearly not going to be adopted anytime soon. From the moment he was placed in the shelter, Charlie's desperate cries began. Soft whimpers echoed through the air, filling the empty spaces of the shelter. Each cry sounded like a plea for help, a call that no one seemed to hear. Lisa, too busy with her other duties, passed by Charlie's kennel every day. She could hear the cries but paid them little mind. "He's probably just adjusting," she would say to herself. "They all cry at first. He'll calm down." But the cries didn't stop. Emily, a new volunteer, was different. She couldn't ignore the sound of Charlie's cries. There was something about the way he sounded that made her feel an overwhelming urge to comfort him. She first noticed him during one of her shifts. His kennel was tucked away in a corner, and from the moment she spotted him, she felt a deep sense of sadness. His eyes were large and full of fear, but they also seemed to hold a quiet plea for help. As the days went on, Emily would stop by Charlie's kennel during her shifts. She would sit quietly, talking softly to him, trying to soothe him with her voice. But despite her efforts, he never calmed. His cries became weaker over time, but there was a sense of hopelessness that hung in the air. It was as if Charlie had accepted that no one was coming. Emily was beginning to feel like she was the only one who cared. Weeks passed, and Charlie's condition didn't improve. His cries had softened, but his health had declined further. He refused to eat, his body growing even thinner, his fur patchier than before. The vibrant, hopeful dog that Emily had hoped to see begin to thrive had become a hollow shell. He had lost his spark. One afternoon, after seeing Charlie hunched in the corner of his kennel, Emily couldn't ignore it any longer. She had to do something. "Lisa, I'm really concerned about Charlie," Emily said, walking over to where Lisa was working. "He's not eating, he's not moving, and he looks even worse than he did when he first got here." Lisa, who had heard the same concerns from volunteers in the past, just shook her head. "He's just adjusting, Emily. You can't expect every dog to bounce back so quickly. It takes time." But Emily wasn't convinced. She had seen too many animals come into the shelter looking worse for wear and eventually recover. But Charlie wasn't recovering. He was fading. "I think he needs to see a vet," Emily insisted. "I know we're busy, but he's not okay. Please, just let me take him in. It could be something serious." Lisa, looking frustrated, finally relented. "Fine. Take him to the vet. But don't come crying to me if it turns out to be nothing." Emily didn't hesitate. She gently lifted Charlie, wrapping him in a blanket, and made her way to the nearby veterinary clinic. She couldn't explain it, but her heart was racing. There was something she wasn't seeing, something deeper than just a shy dog. She had to know what was wrong. Dr. Bennett, the veterinary clinic's chief vet, had seen his fair share of injured and abused animals. But when he examined Charlie, even he was taken aback. "Emily, I need to talk to you," he said, after performing an initial examination. Emily's stomach dropped. "Charlie has old fractures," Dr. Bennett continued, pulling up X-rays of Charlie's tiny body on the screen. "These injuries, his ribs, his legs, and his pelvis, were all broken at some point and healed improperly." Emily's hand flew to her mouth in shock. "How could this happen?" "The fractures are old, which means they were probably inflicted months ago," Dr. Bennett explained. "But that's not all." He paused, looking at Emily with a mixture of sorrow and concern. "We also found signs of poisoning." Emily's heart sank. "Poisoning?" Dr. Bennett nodded. "Yes, the blood work shows traces of a toxic substance. Likely something that was intentionally administered. Whoever did this didn't just neglect Charlie. They hurt him on purpose." Emily could barely speak. She was speechless, her emotions a confusing mix of sadness, anger, and disbelief. How could anyone do such a thing to an innocent creature? Dr. Bennett placed a hand on her shoulder, his tone gentle. "It's not uncommon for abused animals to be poisoned as a way to control them or punish them. But the good news is, with the right care, Charlie can recover." Back at the shelter, Emily shared the news with Lisa and the other staff. For the first time, Lisa's attitude toward Charlie began to change. She had dismissed his cries as mere noise, but now she understood that those cries had been a desperate plea for help. With newfound determination, Emily and the shelter staff began working together to nurse Charlie back to health. His recovery would be slow, but they didn't give up. They administered medication, prepared special meals to tempt his appetite, and spent hours sitting with him, comforting him as he slowly started to regain his strength. Days turned into weeks, and Charlie began to respond. His coat started to shine again, his appetite returned, and his energy increased. But perhaps the most encouraging sign was the return of his spark. His eyes, once dull and lifeless, began to glisten with trust. His tail, once tucked tightly between his legs, slowly started to wag. He began walking around, taking small steps with cautious optimism. At first, his movements were stiff and painful. But as he gained strength, his gait became more fluid, more confident. Emily spent hours talking to him, sitting beside his kennel, and letting him know he wasn't alone. She learned about his fears and triggers, patiently working through them as he began to trust again. Then one day, Charlie did something that made Emily's heart swell with joy. He wagged his tail. Not just a little flicker, but a full, joyful wag. Emily's thoughts continued to linger on Charlie's past. Who had hurt him? Who had inflicted such pain on such a small, vulnerable dog? With Dr. Bennett's help, Emily began to investigate Charlie's history. After a few phone calls and some research, they uncovered a disturbing truth. Charlie had been part of an illegal dog breeding operation, a cruel system where dogs were kept in terrible conditions, bred repeatedly for profit, and then discarded when they were no longer useful. Charlie's injuries and the poisoning were part of this cruel system. He had been abused, neglected, and discarded like a piece of trash. Emily couldn't fathom the cruelty that Charlie had endured, but she was determined to make sure that those responsible paid for their actions. With the help of law enforcement, the breeding operation was shut down, and several animals, including Charlie, were rescued. Months later, Charlie had transformed into a completely different dog. His fur was full and soft, his eyes bright with happiness, and his body strong. He had come so far, and Emily had been there every step of the way. One sunny afternoon, Emily made it official. She signed the adoption papers, officially making Charlie part of her family. As she looked down at Charlie, wagging his tail and looking up at her with adoration, Emily whispered, "You're home now, forever." The story of Charlie's recovery became a beacon of hope to everyone who met him. The once scarred dog had become a symbol of resilience, of healing, and of the power of love. Charlie's story is just one example of the countless animals who suffer every day in silence. Many are neglected, abused, or forgotten, but they all deserve a chance at a better life. If you're inspired by Charlie's journey, consider helping animals in need. Adopt from your local shelter, volunteer your time, or donate to rescue organizations. Together, we can make a difference. Thank you for watching. Remember, love changes everything.